battle lines are drawn, and once again, somebody say, wait, be patient. If they knew how long it would be before all people could truly hear freedom ring, I wonder which end of that moral arc would they choose. I wonder if more would have walked in his shoes. This is what revolution looks like. You gotta get in and then stay in this fight. You've got to find a way to get in the way. Speak out every day. Freedom riders or letter writers, do what you can, just shine your light brighter. Somebody call him the saint among men, a founding father, an icon, a legend, ordinary people. Good morning. I'd ask that you join us for a moment of silence as we remember those who lost their lives in 9/11 20 years ago. Thank you very much. It is my pleasure and my honor as the executive director of the Good Trouble Voting Rights Institute to welcome you to session 2 of our first module, the Voting Rights Act. This is the recap and the post-Reconstruction, the fight over the voting rights. And today we are joined again by our wonderful co-leaders of transformative justice, Dr. Barbara Arnwine. You know her. She is the mother of election protection. She is an expert in voting rights law. She's an expert in anything and everything about transformative justice. And today she will be enlightening us about what happened. And you're going to learn so much from her just during this section. And I'm also glad to welcome today with us also our co-leader, and that would be, I'm gonna call him Dr. too, because he has a JD in a juris in law, and he is the wonderful, the energetic Dr. Daryl D. Jones, and he is just everything. So I am just so glad, and I will turn it over to you so that you can please enlighten us today.
Well, I want to, first of all, thank you so much, Lynn, for introducing us and for directing this amazing institute. And it is a real honor. Everyone has to understand what an honor it is to work besides Daryl Jones, Lynn Whitfield, Yolanda Coley and Jennifer Lohman, Jessica Fortune Barker, Ashley Lee, so many amazing people who help TJC, the Transformative Justice Coalition, to make this Good Trouble Voting Rights Institute possible. It is an honor, and we look forward to bringing some good trouble knowledge this morning about the post-Reconstruction era. Daryl, your intro words.
So, thank you so much, Barbara. You know, to call it good trouble knowledge is one way of looking at it. You know, one of the things that we know is that the more we learn about what has happened in the history, the more that we're able to pull the scales off of the eyes of the fish so that we can clearly see from which the fish has already experienced, it helps us to know what we're dealing with now. And, I would surmise and I would submit to everyone today that as we go through the information today, you will think that the information from 1868 is the information from 2021, because you're going to see a parallelism that exists with regards to what happened during the Reconstruction period, as opposed to as compared to what's happening now. So I encourage you to just sit back and listen to the information. Get your notepad, get your pen out, because there's going to be plenty of information that's coming at you, and be ready to go, wow, it's like it's back where it was. Is this a cyclical thing that's going on? And how do we break this cycle? So, it's going to be really fascinating. Look forward to going through all this information with everyone. And I know we're going to have a good conversation with regards to the presentation of this information.
All right. Well, here we go. First of all, we're going to recap from last week. For those of you who were here last week, this is just a quick review. And for those who weren't, it's a good way of catching up, but you can also always go into the archive and watch this entire session. Our major point last week was that the right to vote initially in the United States was restricted to white male property owners. And the entirety of the story of the United States when it comes to voting has been the expansion of the right to vote, getting rid of the property owners restriction, fighting to get rid of the patriarchal gender restrictions, getting rid of the racial restrictions. All of those have been the fights of this, this entirety, and to try to really make possible the multiracial democracy that we are. We had some interesting news for a lot of people, such as that, California is actually named after an fictional African queen, Califia, and that people don't really know that. I was born and raised in California, never had an idea, but absolutely. I mean, when you go into some of the older buildings, you will see images of Califia everywhere. So people need to know that Queen Khalifa was, in fact, a fictional African queen who people believe that she ruled California with her Amazons in a land full of gold. And these kinds of promises were used to lure European sailors to sail all around the South America, all the way through Central America, up into what we now know as North American region, in order to, quote, conquer that area. Next slide. Sadly, when we think about the right to vote and we think about racial oppression and slavery in the US, one thing that always gets lost is the violence that it took to keep millions of people enslaved. It was an incredibly violent era during slavery. Last time Daryl and I talked about how policing actually came out of the slave patrols in the United States. And in fact, the first US police department wasn't until 1860 something. All that time before, all of the policing was done by slave patrols for all practical purposes. And so it's very important for people to understand that in order to keep millions of people enslaved, working for someone else to make someone else's wealth, having your bodies ruled, your families rendered asunder, all of that, the only way you could make that happen was through violence. Violence was often used. And post-Reconstruction, the violence did not stop. If you go into the archives of the US Congress, they had hearings immediately after the Civil War, during the Reconstruction era. And those hearings are just horrible because they're all about the violence that's being used against Africans, freed African people trying to assert their rights to own property, to just live. The violence is unbelievable. And you have to go and read those hearing records to really understand what our people went through during that time. So that same violence was also used to curtail the Black vote. You see this whole slide right there, Daryl, where of the Black massacres. Make a note, folks, when you look at those Black massacres, note how many of them are immediately in the post-Reconstruction era, and how this was the other manifestation of the violence, right, Daryl?
Absolutely. And Barbara, the slide that we're looking at to the left, the one that says "This nigger voted," is the Opelousas massacre, and that's considered the most violent massacre that has occurred post Reconstruction. And in that massacre, there were actually some. No one's really certain with the number of people, Blacks, that were killed. We know it was somewhere between 150 and somewhere near 300 that were actually killed. We don't know the numbers that were maimed, but what we do know is that it all started because Blacks started voting. At that point, they had been voting Republican, and what was happening is that there was a white guy that came down from Ohio and was teaching Black students and was working with the press, the Republican press there in Louisiana. And he was also teaching young Black students how to read, how to write, and advocating for them politically. And so what happens is, guy's name was Emerson Bentley, who was 18 at the time. Emerson Bentley, in teaching these kids, starts to write and encourages Blacks to get involved in the process now of voting in Louisiana, being registered to vote in Louisiana, and started successfully. Blacks started registering to vote, and they won one of the congressional positions. Well, the Democrats in Louisiana didn't like it, and so they picked up and started saying, we need to suppress these Black votes. If we continue to allow this to happen, then we are going to lose control of everything in Louisiana. And what happened from that was this Opelousas massacre, because they came after this guy, Emerson Bentley, who is considered one of the people that started it because of the teaching and the pushing, and ultimately came to the classroom where Emerson Bentley was teaching, and in front of the young Black students, beat him to a pulp, beat him nearly to death. And he ended up escaping and going back to Ohio, but folks thought that he had died. And so the Blacks came to rescue him in Louisiana, although he was already gone. And that ultimately is what started this Opelousas massacre that occurred in Louisiana. As a result of that, needless to say, Blacks were frightened to vote. The effects that they were after, they were able to have. And that is that they were able to suppress the Black vote, to scare folks into not voting. And that was what's considered the most violent massacre of Blacks during this particular period of time. Just a phenomenal piece of history.
And I want to, Daryl, that was excellent for people to really get a sense of what was going on, because remember, people have, quote, been freed from their plantations, they're wandering, they're trying to find and unite with family, they're trying to build a new life, they're trying to find somewhere to live, all of this, and they're trying to find out how to exercise their rights to vote and how to also make sure that their labor is now compensated instead of stolen as it had been under slavery. And so all of these things, all these factors are coming together. I want to just point out one more of the Black massacres. I mean, a lot of people, of course, this year was the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa massacre, but I want to talk about Colfax really quickly. The Colfax massacre of 1873, which was also in Louisiana, where police assisted private whites to attack a political convention that was being held of the basically Reconstructionists, and a lot of African American elected officials and others were there, trying to talk with their white counterparts about how to expand the Black vote, how to make it more effective. And in that massacre, they ended up killing over, once again, we don't know the real numbers, but over 100 something Black people, Black men. Because remember, the 15th Amendment gave the right to vote to Black men, which is something we talked about in the last course. But I do want to point out that as a result of that massacre, there was a case that was taken to the Supreme Court called U.S. versus Cruikshank, Cruishank. It is the first real interpretation of the 14th Amendment. And whether or not the 14th Amendment's restrictions on the denial of equal protection of the laws extended to private citizens. And this is where the court announces for the first time its doctrine of, that it has to be state action. And even though the police were involved here, the court ignored that and attributed all the action to, quote, private actors, and said there was nothing that could be done to bring anybody to account for killing hundreds of, over 100 Black folks, because there was no, quote, state action. And that doctrine, you're going to see right now, is playing out in Texas, where they created this new anti-abortion law. And you notice that in that law, there's no, quote, enforcement by the state. All the enforcement is in private snitches who are to, run around and get up $10,000 if they report somebody. That is part of our Supreme Court doctrines, history, and legacy. And Colfax massacre and the U.S. versus Cruikshank case set up that entirety of that processing. Moving on to the next slide. The most infamous action of the Congress of the United States, one of the most infamous, because there's plenty, the Hayes-Tilden Compromise of 1876. This compromise came out of a contested election where it wasn't clear who had won. And in order to give a victory to Rutherford Hayes, there was a compromise reached between the between the Reconstructionist Congress and those who were on the Democratic side of that Congress, which was the pro-slavery side. Remember, one thing that gets lost in teaching this entire era is that people don't understand something fundamental, that post the Civil War, for those first 10 years, the issue is, what is the Union? Who is part of the Union? All those secessionist states were actually no longer states within the definition of governance of the Union. In fact, many people, and Justice Marshall and others have pointed out, for all practical purposes, there was no US Constitution that was in effect for a couple of years after the Civil War. So it is the process of reconstructing the Union. Reconstruction isn't a reconstruction of rights, it's a reconstruction of the Union, bringing back into the fold of governance all the secession rebellion states. And as a consequence, they had to agree to many different conditions, including the 1870 Enforcement Act, which also eventually becomes the 15th Amendment of the United States, the right to vote for African Americans. Well, similarly, the Democrats who were the pro-Southern forces, slavery forces, as they get readmitted, gain power again within the Congress. And even though, quote, the lost cause was over, they are not at all remorseful. They are determined to reassert slavery in every way that they can. And so part of the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, the worst aspect of it is that they agreed to withdraw the Southern troops. And people don't understand what that meant. When they agreed to withdraw the Union troops from the South, what that meant was that the protection from massacres, the protection from atrocities, the protection from torture, the protection from re-enslavement, all went away because that's what the Union troops did. And I pointed out in the last teaching that the Union Army at that point was almost predominantly Black. It was significantly African-American. And so the fact that Black men had guns, that's why there's such a hatred of Black men with guns in so much of this United States, because of the legacy of the Union Army enforcing against Southern whites and in the border territories, the rights of African Americans to social and voting equality. So this compromise, when you take away those troops, who do you leave those people to? You leave them to the Klan, the rule of the Klan, and the Klan just grows exponentially during this period. Daryl, anything else you want to say about the Hayes-Tilden Compromise?
And Barbara, it's really interesting because it's not just the Klan that you leave them to, right?
Right.
The Klan, for purposes of this analysis, is sort of like calling it a Xerox, right? You have all different kinds of copies that are out there. And the Klan certainly had all types of copy cuts that were there that served as vigilantes, just ready and willing and able to want to go out and inflict the terror on Blacks. The interesting thing, I think, Barbara, with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise of 1877 was that it's considered, because of all the reasons that you've stated, it's considered to be the great betrayal, right?
Right.
Because the belief was that the federal government was going to protect all of these citizens that were now given their freedom. And as a result of what happens here with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise and the withdrawal of the troops, the protection of these newly freed Blacks was taken away. What was promised was taken away from them. And so you had states like South Carolina, Florida, again, Louisiana, back in the mix again, that immediately go in and start suppressing, scaring, and for all intents and purposes, ending the Reconstruction era. The Hayes-Tilden Great Betrayal Compromise is the ending of the Reconstruction era. And there were some 4 million plus slaves that were in the South during that time that were relying on these federal troops to protect them from the disenfranchising acts of those state legislatures. And once they were withdrawn, those state legislatures just had their way with what they wanted to do down there. Thus, it's considered the Great Betrayal in Black history with regards to the Hayes-Tilden Compromise.
Yes, thank you, Daryl. Next slide, because here's the post-Reconstruction story that Daryl was just talking about. And that is that between 1890 and 1908, 10 of the 11 Southern states rewrote their constitutions, rewrote them. And most were designed to deny the, quote, freedmen the freed African male, because it was men, Black men who were given the right to vote by the 15th Amendment. And they designed these to deny that new voter their rights. And so you see here, one of the test devices that was used was called literacy tests. Now, mind you, some of the people administering the literacy tests could not read themselves. And indeed, one of the stories that people don't understand is that public education was created in the aftermath of slavery to make sure that the freed men was in fact educated. And up until then, most education was very much private. And the entire movement, to go back to private academies, to have, school choice where, people can pick their own schools, all of that is still a response to the fact that public education is created during this period during the Reconstruction period to educate the freedmen. All the Black HBCUs, a lot of them are founded during the same period. And so literacy tests, they thought would be a great way of blocking Africans from voting, freed Africans from voting, because they knew that a lot of people had not had the benefit of an education. And because remember, it was illegal to teach Blacks to read and write. So they were using this legacy, this structural racism legacy to try to block Blacks from voting. Next slide. Let's talk about Louisiana. Daryl, you want to talk about this one? Because the stats on this slide are telling. We already told you about the massacres, how many of them were in Louisiana, and you saw on that slide. But let's talk about what Louisiana actually did.
Yeah, Barbara, what's interesting with this slide is, what we have set up to this point was the explanation of what was going on in Louisiana and the push that they had through the massacre there to try to suppress, to keep down the Blacks from coming out to vote. This slide demonstrates the success of what they did in coming after Blacks and stopping them from wanting to register to vote. So, they went from in 1896 over 130,000 African Americans that were registered to vote into 1898 when they amended the Constitution. And once that was amended, 2 years later, we have less than 5,000 African Americans then registered to vote in Louisiana. Just incredible. 1910, only 730 on the rolls. So the concept of the suppression, to scaring them, to saying, if you come to try to register, we're going to hang you, we're going to kill you, all this other stuff, it worked. It worked. And this is what they were after, and this is what they achieved.
And next slide. Thank you, Daryl. One thing I do want to always point out is that, Black people never just sat around and allowed their rights to be taken. We fought in every way that we could fight. One thing that's rarely taught about this period, I like to say that what we have to understand about the Reconstruction period is that we might have ended slavery, that the Civil War ended slavery, but it did not end white supremacy. What you have happening in the post-Reconstruction era, especially after the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, is the reinstitution of white supremacy at a huge and phenomenal rate of cooperation between white elites and the media and others to re-enslave, to demonize Black people, and to make sure that Black people lose their rights and that whites are elevated. Now, people will say, well, wait a minute, Barbara, wasn't there a whole war to end the slavery? Yes, but ending slavery is not the same as ending white supremacy. In fact, a lot of people who supported, the abolishment of slavery believed in white supremacy. And that belief in white supremacy still dominates our culture. But Black women in 1895 had what was called the African American, it was called the Colored Women's Convention in 1895 in Boston. And the purpose of that convention was to fight the demonization of Black women in the media, because the media was used to really do two purposes: to demonize Black folks so that people would feel any denial of their rights was justified, but also it was used to build into white consciousness the fact that being white was more important than anything, more important than your union rights, more important than your labor rights. It was used to make sure that free Blacks and poor whites, working class whites, would never unite. It was a whole media campaign that was vicious, absolutely vicious, from the 1880s until, way into today, even, where we see, the media being used to stereotype Black people. Well, Black women came together and organized their convention in 1895, basically to fight this demonization of Black women's images, and to fight for political power and to start demanding the right for women to vote. And that is, most of us know this whole movement as the Black Women's Club movement. Moving on. Next slide. Yes. Wow. If you have not read the George White farewell address to Congress in 1901, there's no way to really understand our fight for voting rights. This is possibly the best speech ever given on the floor of the Congress. Even those who were celebrating the fact that Congressman George White is the last Black in Congress. Remember, there were over 16 African-American congressmen during Reconstruction. We talked about this last time. There were thousands of African-Americans elected to different positions, but post the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, all of these gains are taken away and viciously assaulted. And he is the victim of everything from redistricting to violence to mutilation of people trying to vote for him to registration fraud, all kinds of things that are done to make sure that he cannot be reelected to Congress. And he's the congressman from North Carolina. And he says in his farewell address, after going through all these vicious forms of voter suppression that were used to destroy his seat, he says that Phoenix-like, the Negro shall rise again. And Daryl, it will take 90 years before North Carolina will elect another Black to Congress.
And just amazing, Barbara, because one of the things with George White was that he was elected overwhelmingly, right? 1896, and then reelected in 1898 because members of Congress served 2-year terms, and then when it was time for him to run again in 1900, that's when we had, as you indicated, all the changes that came as a result of that Hayes-Tilden Compromise, and rather than put himself through what was going to be a setup election because of the disenfranchisement that had occurred to African Americans in North Carolina, he elected to not run again. And as you've indicated, Barbara, the amazing thing is, it wasn't until 1992 that a Black woman named Eva Clayton
That's right.
was the next Black elected out of North Carolina to Congress. In that following year, she was followed by a Black man, Mel Watt, who was
That's
elected in
correct.
'93. So just amazing to go through the history. But it's initially, Barbara, what we said in the opening, watch what's happening then and see what's happening now. And we see the same disenfranchisement tactics being attempted now that we saw being attempted then. Just an amazing, amazing piece of history.
Absolutely. Next slide. Absolutely. Before I get to this slide, I just want to, because Daryl's going to talk about this slide, I just want people to know that there's something else happening in American culture during this time. Many people thought that when slavery ended, slavery ended. That's not really true, right? We know that it took, years for people in Texas and Oklahoma to become aware that the Emancipation Proclamation had been rendered and that they were, quote, freed. But we also know that Douglas Blackman has documented in Slavery by Another Name, the story of the disenfranchisement of African Americans, mainly men who were re-enslaved through the convict leasing system. They would find any excuse to arrest Black men and to then, as a quote convict, to lease them to all these factories, to the railroad system. Convict leasing labor built the industrialization of the South during the post-Reconstruction era. It was Black labor that was used to build the South, because remember, the whole contest during the Civil War was between the industrialized North and the more agricultural South. And as the South tried to catch up in its industrialization, it needed that labor. And remember, they were accustomed to having free labor and not paying for Black labor. So in order to keep that going, they created the convict leasing system, which became known as the Slavery by Another Name. And it was crueler, so cruel in so many ways, so absolutely inhumane, the way that Black men were just worked to death, and Black women, by the way, were just worked to death because they didn't care if they killed them or not, because there was no value. They could always go and get another person, always go and arrest another Black person for just walking down the street. It didn't matter. They created any excuse necessary. And Slavery by Another Name, you got to read that book by Douglas Blackman. It's critical to understanding this period. Okay, Confederate statues, Daryl.
Thanks, Barbara. And it's really interesting because what you're talking about with regards to what happens really is a terror. It's a line of terroristic activity that goes along to suppress Blacks from voting and discourage and scare Blacks, intimidate from wanting to vote. Well, the Confederate statute was just that. It was, the Confederate statutes that went up were a reminder in these communities that, there was this era, there was this feeling that you should be intimidated. We want to remind you of the intimidation that we've implored upon you. And that's what the Confederate statutes, in my mind, were significant of and were reminders of. It was sort of a trail of terror for the Black community throughout the United States. But what was interesting, the Confederate statutes started being erected in the early 1900s. That's when they started going up all across the country. As these statutes are going up to remember that trail of terror that many of the Black communities had just come out of, they were hoping that it would continue to tell that story and that legacy would hold on to continue to suppress Blacks from voting. That's my analysis on it. But you know what? Something happened that they did not anticipate happening in American history. And that is, there was a group of young Black folks throughout this country that said, we ain't having it no more. We want these Confederate statutes to come down. We understand what they recognize. We understand what they mean. We're not intimidated. We're not backing down. And as we sit in this country today, this week, in the heart of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia, the Richard E. Lee statue that had been fought for.
Robert E. Lee, yes.
Excuse me, Robert E. Lee that had been fought for and that was standing there has come down this week. This week, that statute has come down. So, the intimidation factor that had been there for decades now is being broken. And with the Robert E. Lee statute down, with the movement now to pick up and to say we're moving forward, we're not intimidated, it's going to be, I think, a great day for our country. It's a great moment for our youth and what they were able to accomplish and all that supported them. So the Confederate statutes that were there, they're coming down. They're coming down across the country, and that trail of terror, I am hoping, will now be squashed. That's where we are right now.
Well, that's why we love our young people for their organizing and their strength. Next slide. Poll tax was another one that was used. There were so many, devices that were used to deny Blacks the ability to vote. They knew that by keeping Blacks as sharecroppers, by the convict leasing system, by all those things, they knew that Blacks would not be able to pay these poll taxes. Also, we should note that this is the era of the rise of felony disenfranchisement statutes. Mm-hmm. There's a direct correlation between all of this convict leasing and just re-enslavement of Black people by just tons, putting them into prisons and leasing them out to private companies. I'm serious, folks. You can go through the records of how many companies, corporations, not just individual white farmers that engaged in this convict leasing, the railroads, all of this. And so they knew that the poll tax was something Blacks couldn't afford to pay. And it was part of, that entire era of disenfranchisement. So you have the poll tax. You also have these felony disenfranchisement laws that basically said that if you had ever been arrested and convicted of a felony or of a crime, that you could not. In some states, it didn't even matter if it was a felony or not. It was just, any kind of crime, you could not vote. And there were, several Supreme Court cases dealing with that fact. Moving on to the next slide, because our time is running, sadly. We talked about the media and we talked about the Klan and their role, but we also got to recognize that during this period, as part of the, quote, re-enslavement was Jim Crow. As the institution of Jim Crow laws, that were the segregationist laws that became dominant during this era. So dominant that people got to understand that when the Nazis in Germany wanted to construct the concentration camps and the whole system of the entirety of the Nazis hurting and killing Jewish people to make the Holocaust happen, that they actually came and studied the US and they studied the Jim Crow laws as their basis for what became known as the Holocaust era. I want people to, if you think I'm kidding you, there's a whole book that you can read on this about Hitler's, US model, and you will be able to follow that consciousness. Next slide, really quickly. Oh, Lord, Daryl. Birth of a nation. Birth of a nation. President Woodrow Wilson was one of the most segregationist presidents to ever serve in the United States. And he and his wife were such segregationists that his wife would literally go into the buildings to look at how many Blacks were employed by different federal agencies and raise hell about it. and would make sure that those federal agencies did not employ Blacks any longer. I mean, that's how vicious their racism was as a team. And we know everybody celebrates him as the creator of the League of Nations, which eventually becomes the United Nations. But let's be clear, he was a vicious segregationist. And he actually had, as you can see here by this invitation, a screening of Birth of a Nation, which was a vicious movie. If you've never seen it, it's horrible to watch, but it basically portrays Blacks as monkeys, as subhuman animals, and it makes fun of African Americans trying to be elected officials. It's basically a justification for denying the right to vote to Black people, and shows Black men as rapists of white women, just as fools, as unintelligent as monkeys. I mean, it's a horrendous piece of propaganda. Daryl?
Barbara, the last line on that slide, if you were to just focus on it, it would just give you all that you needed to know. It is funded on what? Thomas Dixon's historical novel, The Klansman. Is that what that says? Am I reading that right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's all that you need to know about the birth of a nation. That's about it. And the way that it was then portrayed, and it was just incredible. All that you said, Barbara, is just on point with regards to how we should view this president, that president, with regards to the birth of a nation and his policies at that point in time.
And, and people don't understand that, when it says it was based on the Klansman, is that this movie celebrates the Klan as the heroes, the champions of the era, the white knights of the era who are saving civilization from these outrageously uncouth African-American animals. Moving on to the next slide. The 19th Amendment was passed, in 1920, and basically, people, Black women were very involved in that fight. But it turns out, of course, that Black women are denied the right to vote, even though they fought so seriously, so hard for the 19th Amendment. Moving on to the next slide. And you can see some of the Black women who were involved. That's a great slide, of some of the Black women who worked so hard to make everything happen. Next slide. Well, Daryl, I think at some point, Lynn, we are going to run out of time. Lynn, do you want us to continue, or do you want us to hold off and finish next week? Because we have a couple more slides after this one.
I'm going to leave that to your discretion. I have someone who's going to pick up after I'm gone, but I can, well, you know what? It is 11:55, so this might be a good place to stop with this part, and then we can pick up next week with starting with this slide and going on through.
And what do you think, Daryl?
I think that's fine. It's a good idea.
Yeah, I just want, again, and there was so much to cover in this period. It was more than we thought, and we tried to get through it all. But I think that people really need to understand that this period is seminal. You cannot understand America as it exists today with its white structural racist system unless you really understand this period, because it set up everything that happened. I see some people are saying, well, why don't we start making these 90 minutes instead of an hour, so that we can get through and that we can cover all the incredible information. But I just want people to really know that the reason why we went through this in such depth is that it's rarely taught. There's so much more that we could say about this era but we really want people to understand that the entire political structure, the entire strictures, the entire restrictions on voting, all of this grows out of this era, that you really don't understand America racism unless you really understand the post-Reconstruction era. Right, Daryl?
Absolutely. And Barbara, the other piece that I certainly want to add to what you've stated is this. Folks need to understand that in any state that has said that they will not allow critical race theory to be taught, what you're hearing here, they would never learn it. They would not learn it. That's the reason that we have this institute. That's the reason that we encourage people to come and get it here, so you get the unbridled piece of history, the learning of it, the knowledge of it, the facts of it, and what actually happened, and what we think you need to put into your reservoir of information when you're making decisions. That's why we're doing this, folks. That's a large part of the reason that we're doing this. That's what I wanted to say, Bob.
All right, next week we'll have a slide where you can see that, Hitler's American model and other information about how Jim Crow was used basically to construct, Nazi Germany as it became known, and how it was used to construct, South Africa. So many other things about American apartheid that we really need to understand is worldwide global influence. So there's so much to be said, and we want to thank everybody who was able to hang with us. We stopped, basically in the 1920s. When we pick up, we'll take you all the way through the 1960s, and we will thank everybody again. Our thanks to everyone who has tuned in to watch. Our thanks to all of the great people who are part of the teach-in committee, as we call it, the Voting Rights Institute Committee. We are grateful to each and every one of you, and especially to our director, the mighty attorney, Lynn Whitfield. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you both, Daryl and Barbara. That was so informative. And one of the reasons there was a question in the chat, why don't we make it 90 minutes, is we want to give you enough time to really absorb and for us to take our time and get out the information to it. And we are also very mindful of your time on a Saturday afternoon. And with that, Yolanda, if you could share, please do not leave. If you are here as a registrant and you are looking to be certified, do not leave, because next is the call to action. So Yolanda, if you would put up that slide. And Ashley is going to handle the call to action. I want to thank everyone. My time was short today, so thank you. I'm out of here. Ashley, it's all yours and Yolanda's.
Well, hello, good troublemakers. I mean, if you're like me, you are just beaming with information and need probably a couple of hours to absorb all of the content from Dr. Arnwine and our Dr. Jones. But we're good troublemakers, so we have to get into good trouble. So here's to this week's call to action. Family is important. And so we want you to share your family's history about their fight for voting rights, how they got into good trouble for voting rights. We want you to share photographs that may memorialize that fight. And then, the photographs that were displayed in today's session, let us know what they mean to you. I was caught off guard by some of the photographs that I saw, and I can't wait to go to the Facebook group page, the Good Trouble Voting Rights Institute, to talk about some of those feelings that I felt when I watched and saw those photographs come up on the screen. We also want you to pick a massacre from the massacre map that was shown and learn more about it. I've already taken a couple of notes of which massacres I'm going to research. We're going to load that map onto the Facebook group, so please make sure that you've joined the Good Trouble Voting Rights Institute Facebook page. You can answer the questions, and if you continue to do this, you will get your certification. We look forward to seeing you next week. Continue to get in good troublemakers.
Hi, I'm Oliver. I'm 12, so I have a while So until then, I'm gonna learn everything I can. In school, I've been learning that people used to not be able to have the right to vote because they were different. And to me, that doesn't feel right. So when I become 18, I'm gonna make my voice be heard by everyone. And I'm gonna vote for who I want to vote. And that's what I think about voting. Thank you. Hi, I'm Oliver.
So we are finished, I believe, right? Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
Blessings. Take care.
Bye-bye.